Good morning, everybody, especially on the live stream. Today is our last of the Christmas the Real Story sessions. Just as a reminder, for the next 3 Sundays after this, we have one worship service at 10 o'clock. So the 18th, the children's led, Christmas Day is at 10 o'clock, New Year's Day is at 10 o'clock, and so we won't have class again until the 8th of January. Okay? And at that point, we'll start something new. Unless I haven't figured out what we're going to start yet, and then we'll have a Stump the Pastor Sunday before we move into something new. Stump the Pastor Sundays for our new folks are always fun because that means they can ask any question they want, and I'll pretend like I know the answers. So, but today we're going to do something a little different. I told Jody I'm going to try to ruin Christmas for everybody today. I'm kidding. But let's start with prayer, and then we'll jump in. We praise you, O Lord, for the gift that you give us at Christmas, the birth of our Savior, Jesus Christ. As we've been thinking about many of the things that are left unthought about at Christmas, you have blessed us over these last few weeks. Bless us again today as we take a look at a Christmas story not often read by us. Bless us as we grow in our understanding of your gift to us and the blessing of being called your children. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so on your sheets it says our hallmark, in parentheses. I didn't put a what do you call it, a trademark thing on it, so, don't pass these out publicly. Our hallmark Christmases often miss the significance of the birth of Jesus. What if we could see his birth from heaven's perspective? Might it give us a different perspective on Christmas? How blessed we are to have another Christmas story, one rarely read at Christmas, to help us understand how Jesus' birth changed the course of history. So we're going to go ahead and start with question 1 because you have no idea what we're doing yet. So, how many Christmas narratives are there in the Bible, and where are they found? So, who can think of one of the places we can find a Christmas narrative? Luke is definitely one of them, right? We've been reading portions of that from Luke chapter 2. All right? Where else? Matthew. Matthew and Luke are kind of traditionally the story, right? The travel to Bethlehem, the no room in the inn, born in a manger, angels come to the shepherds, shepherds come to the manger, and then we co-opt what probably was another year or more later, the wise men into the story, right? In between Christmas and the wise men coming, we've got accounts of Jesus being circumcised on the 8th day and going to the temple on the 40th day after his birth for the purification of Mary. All those things are the dedication of Jesus as the family's firstborn. So all those things are part of Matthew and Luke. Where's the third one?
I'm going to argue John 1.
John 1, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and everything was made by the Word, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. Glory is of the one and only, sent by the Father. And so John is, and on Christmas morning, that is the narrative that we typically read on Christmas morning, if I remember correctly. Okay? So that's 3. How about the 4th one? Isaiah, kind of. I mean, you can kind of pick out a few things in different places. We've got prophecies of the birth in Isaiah. We'll hear one next week from Isaiah chapter 7 about the virgin giving birth. But that's not typically considered a Christmas narrative. We've got other things in some of the Old Testament prophets that speak of the birth to come. Paul obviously points back to the birth every once in a while, though his focus is more on the death and resurrection of Jesus than it is on the birth, for good reason. Okay? That's what they just said, no? Revelation chapter 12. So open up your Bibles to Revelation chapter 12. And I dare say this Christmas narrative, I have never heard it read on Christmas Day, probably for good reason. But this is indeed a full, if you will, Christmas narrative. And I think the best way to introduce this, we'll read all of chapter 12, is that this is Christmas from heaven's perspective. Right? Matthew, Luke, and even John in his cryptic, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us," is what we see from our perspective. Remember, the book of Revelation is John's vision of heaven. And so there's a lot of things going on in here. It repeats itself. Revelation repeats itself basically 7 times and all that kind of stuff, right? But what you're going to hear about here from Revelation chapter 12 is a different perspective on the birth of Jesus Christ. And it's got a character that normally is not included in our nativity scenes. Okay? We will talk about that. So let's read Revelation chapter 12. I'll read it, and you listen along and see if you can't pick out some things that are different than is typically going on. This is not the narrative that the kids will be using next week to tell us the Christmas story, okay? And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns on his heads, 7 diadems, and on his head 7 diadems. His tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. Now a war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back, and he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, "Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they love not their lives even unto death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows that his time is short. And when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the woman was given the 2 wings of the great eagle, so that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness, to the place where she is to be nourished for a time and times and a half a time. The serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman, to sweep her away with a flood. But the earth came to the help of the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from his mouth. Then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. And he stood on the sand of the sea. It's a little bit different, isn't it? It's a little bit different. I mean, the first 6 verses, we could have stopped right there. There's reason to go on, because it really carries on. It brings up the woman and the child again later. So it really all is. But hopefully you can see in at least the first 6 verses, you can see this Christmas narrative, right? The virgin giving birth to a son, right? But what's different about it? There's quite a few things different about it.
Shows the role of Satan.
Yeah, I mean the big thing that jumps out at you, right, is the role of Satan. What else? Mary is portrayed a little differently here, right? With clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. Makes her sound pretty important, isn't she? Doesn't it? Is she? Yeah. At one point, person who grew up Roman Catholic was decided that they'd like to be part of Rivercliff. Had been through all this stuff, but they had one question for me that had to get answered because they were very, very concerned because she had grown up being taught that Mary was the mother of God, and she said, "I'm not going to stop believing that." I said, "Good, because we believe it too." And her face about fell off. And I said, "Yeah, she's the mother of God. Jesus is God. Mary is her mother. We don't got to pray to her." And she goes, "Oh, okay, we're good." And it was all done. But I think sometimes, almost in our desire to, there's a lot of things that the Roman Catholic Church does that because we're the Lutherans who were telling the Roman Catholics they were wrong so long ago, we try to keep at a distance because we don't want anybody to believe that we're Roman Catholic. And I think understanding Mary and her place, she's not part of the divinity. She's not our Savior, but she gave birth to him. If Mary doesn't have a special place in heaven, I'm going to be really, really, really disappointed, right? And this kind of gives that picture, doesn't it, of Mary in heaven. What else? I mean, we got to go through a bunch of this, but go ahead.
Well, the fact that she flees to the desert, is that Egypt?
Yeah, so the fleeing to the desert, we need to unpack all that because it is a significant piece of the story that if we don't understand what it's saying, we'll lose a big part of it. So yes, we'll have to talk about that, okay? And this ongoing war, right? The Christmas story is almost portrayed as the baby's born and all hell breaks loose. I don't mean that as cussing, I mean that literally, right? All hell breaks loose. And it's a different vision, right? All of a sudden I get this Ephesians 6, right? But your battles are not against flesh and blood, but against the principalities, the evil darkness of the world, right? I get that kind of vision that Paul gave us in Ephesians. Jesus is born, and things come unglued in the heavenly realms. Okay? Not just angels singing gently off in the countryside, but the birth of Jesus unpacks a war. And that's what we're going to have to kind of understand even for ourselves. Questions, comments? Yeah.
It indicates, when you said war, that the war happened at his birth. I was kind of being Good Friday, the war part. It was sealed. The deal was done.
The end of the war is done on Good Friday, but the beginning happens at his birth. Now, I mean, you can argue the beginning happens when Adam and Eve sin and right things are going on from then. But, there's this, and again, I love the movie. I haven't seen it in ages. It's not much of a Christmas movie, so I probably won't watch it right now this time of the year. But The Passion of the Christ, right? And you have that opening scene where the serpent slithers out from underneath the robe of who is Satan, and Jesus stands up from praying in the garden and takes his heel and crushes the head of the serpent, taking us back to the Genesis 3:15. But it opens up this whole idea that the war that really began with Adam and Eve comes to a very new place with the incarnation of Jesus Christ. Okay? Now, I introduced this, so we just did number 2. I introduced this as the birth of Jesus from heaven's perspective. Right? None of this, really, did anybody see. right? They didn't see the Virgin Mary like this. They didn't understand this war going on, right? But, so, number 3, imagine our nativity scene. Cows, sheep, shepherds, kings, and a red dragon. Okay? And a red dragon. So it's pretty obvious to us, but let's unpack this a little bit. What's going on here? Right? This is, let's say, what God the Father, what all the heavenly realms are seeing as Jesus is born. Who's the red dragon, and what is going on here? So who's the red dragon? Satan. Okay, that should be fairly obvious to everybody, right?
Well, it's the beginning of the fulfillment of the promise that God would say.
Yeah, so we've got the beginning of the fulfillment of the promise. What promise?
To send the Savior.
Right, to send the Savior. This goes back to Genesis 3:15, right? He will bruise his, right, the seed of Satan will bruise the heel of the seed of Eve, and the seed of Eve will, in your ESV it says bruised again, but I like the emphasis from our older versions, crush the head of Satan. Okay? Now, one thing that always strikes me when I think about something like this, I don't care who they are. I had a professor in seminary who had the entire Bible memorized. I mean, to the point of, what does 1 Chronicles 15 verse 6 say? Now, it might take him a minute to think his way through to verse 6, but he could quote it for you. Okay? But even there is a being that knows the Bible better than he did. Satan. Think about it. Everybody else around, Eve in her surprise, Joseph in his surprise, and then how many people around refuse to believe that Jesus' birth is the fulfillment of the prophecies in the Old Testament? But who absolutely knows it's true? Satan. Right? So he ain't going to miss this. Right? One of the scariest places that I find myself every once in a while is late at night in church. Believe it or not. Sometimes all by yourself, late at night in church when it's dark, it's a scary place. And you say, well, why? It's God's house. Yep. I can guarantee Satan's not leaving this place alone. Okay? Guaranteed, Satan's going to be at the side of the manger. Why?
Because it's his end.
This is Satan's his end. This is Satan's first chance to ruin the plan. Right? Which gospel account is it? Is it Mark? At the end of by the way, we didn't bring up Mark for Christmas, by the way, right? Ain't there, okay? At the end of the account of Jesus' baptism, it says that Satan went away from him after the temptation in the wilderness. Satan went away from him until a more opportune time. So from the moment of his birth, because Satan could do nothing about the conception, I guess he could have tried to kill Mary, but right? From the moment of his birth, this gives us this sense of what is Satan bound and determined to do? Make Jesus sin. He's bound and determined to keep Jesus from the cross. Right? If he can eat him as a child, right? And we'll talk in a minute about how that actually he tried. If he can eat him as a child, he never gets to the cross. If he can get him to sin in the wilderness, when he goes to the cross, he's only going for himself, not for us. Right? Hey, if you are the Christ, right, twice. First, the Pharisees and the leaders of the church standing around. If he is the Christ, let him come down from there. If he comes down, he proves to everybody he's the Christ, but he's worthless. And then the thief on the cross. If you are the Christ, take yourself down and take us with you. Satan did not give up. He starts here at the manger, if you will, and he is not going to give up because he knows this is his undoing. It was promised, right? In the Garden of Eden, he will crush the head of Satan. And Satan is bound and determined to undo it. Okay? I don't remember whatever questions I asked. Oh. So, going on with question 3, okay? So, Satan's bound and determined to eat the child, it says. Where was that? Tail swept, verse 4. Halfway through, and the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. And he gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne, and the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. So first of all, did Satan make an attempt to devour Jesus? How did that happen?
The baby.
Yeah. Herod, right? Herod orders the killing of the firstborn in Bethlehem. Okay? So the answer to Barb's comment, right, is this now portraying the wilderness thing about other lady, Mary and Joseph taking Jesus to Egypt? Yes and no. Okay? Because she gave birth to a male child, check. One who is to rule all the nations with an iron rod, check. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. So is this about Mary and Joseph going to Egypt? Yes and no, right? This turns into a narrative of Jesus' entire life. Okay? So, Satan attempts to undo the plan. And we can go back to the story of Jesus' life and we can find those places where it happens more than once. The big ones, right? After the temptation in the wilderness, and then at the cross, just give up. Prove to everybody you're God, right? But in proving to everybody you're God, right? So all of that kind of comes, and then you've even got the placing the soldiers at the tomb, sealing the tomb shut, everything that Satan can do to undo this plan. Does Satan know exactly what the plan is? Not exactly, but he's got a lot of hints, right? Isaiah, more than a birth narrative, has a has a fairly detailed death narrative of Jesus. Okay? And Satan understood it as exactly that. So Satan's got an idea how all this is going to happen. How's he going to get it to stop? And Satan is working Jesus' entire life to undo this plan. Right? We only get the glimpses, right? We don't have a deep... Yeah, go ahead.
But Satan is only in the present tense of that time, right? In other words, we have the perspective of the entire New Testament. He didn't have that, am I correct? Because he's not like God, omniscient. You know what I'm asking?
Yes and no. Yeah, Satan doesn't have the complete foreknowledge that God has. But we also got to be careful with understanding foreknowledge because it's not something we understand real well. Are the angels with God? Then they are outside of time. Satan was created outside of time. He was created in the beginning. We don't know when the angels were created. It doesn't say that, but we know they were created. But they are with God. So God is outside of time. The people who have died before us in the faith are with God. They're outside of time. So that completely undoes all of our trying to figure out all that stuff. Okay? Because we have no idea what that means. That's why, I've said it before, I think Einstein was the closest to understanding God that anybody has gotten on earth. Or closest to understanding eternity. Because he began to envision a reality outside of time. Partially shown in his mathematics, but never completely shown in his mathematics. That's why I'm absolutely convinced mathematicians are the most phenomenally intelligent people on the face of the earth. Yes, that was self-serving. But we don't really understand what that... So when you ask a question like that, right, Satan has a different perspective on time than we have. He has a different understanding of Scripture than we have. I'll suggest a perfect understanding of Scripture, at least as perfect as someone who didn't write it can have, meaning God who wrote the whole thing. But, so what Satan understood, what he knew, right, especially when we go back and read Isaiah, is it 53 or 57, I can't remember, the death of Jesus, we go back and go, wow, this thing is more detailed than any of the gospel accounts on how Jesus died, right? The gospel accounts just say they hang him on the cross and he dies. Isaiah goes through excruciating detail about what that death is like. And so how does all that get put together? So that's my wishy-washy way of saying, no, Satan is not God. He does not know the things that God knows, but he knows a whole lot more than we do and has a different perspective than we do.
Would it be like me knowing that I'm going to die in an accident, just leave it that way, on a certain day at a certain time, and I do everything in my life to prevent that moment? Is that kind of where Satan's...
I guess that's probably not a bad way to look at it. Yeah.
The idea of what Satan knows, he's very old. He's had a lot of experience. And in some ways, he knows God even better than we do. So I think even when the woman's seed shall crush the serpent's head, Satan already anticipated that God had some sort of plan.
Right.
It's not going to be good for him.
Right.
Because he knew that's how God works. And as he saw it working out in history, as he lived that history with us, Satan attempted to frustrate it any way he could, including messing with Israel all the time and trying to get them off the track and thrown them into exile, and God keeps keeping his promise all the way through.
You can see Satan trying to destroy the line of David because he knows that the Messiah is coming from the line of David. You can see Satan trying to destroy the patriarchs of Israel, right? At Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? And we have that wonderful learning from all that in spite of what Satan's able to accomplish with human beings, God's plan's still going to get him, right? Now he's left with this human being. Problem is, he's not just a human being. Okay? Yeah.
When we read like the first 6 verses of chapter 12, how far do you take it that this is a realistic description as opposed to John's vision?
Well, even in this, so the question, just for the folks on, is how far do we take something like verses 1 through 6? how far do we take it as realistic versus just John's vision? Because we teach that Revelation is apocalyptic and full of signs. Well, this is full of signs too. All of Revelation is real. It's not just an allegory meant to teach us something. Everything in Revelation is real. It's just taught with a whole bunch of symbolism. Okay? So now, is Satan's name ever brought up in Revelation 12? Oh, is it? Where is it? 9? Oh, that's right. It was and the ancient serpent. So in this case, John, in his vision, explains who the red dragon is. But we got the red dragon. We got Mary is pregnant, but she's got a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon and under her feet. All of this stuff is signs. What's the 1,260 days? About 3-point-something years. So what's it mean?
That's how long Jesus preached on earth.
Maybe. Some will say that's how long he was in Egypt. Of course, we also have all kinds of combinations of numbers in Revelation that add up to something different. And this 1,260 is a number that represents the time of the Christian church on earth after Jesus' ascension into heaven. So it's still all symbolism. So when you ask the question, how much of this are we supposed to understand is real and how much of it is vision? All of Revelation is real. Okay? Now, all of Revelation is written in symbols. Okay? And so until you have to unpack all the symbolism and try to understand what all these things mean. Okay? And we've done some of that before, but so that's the best answer I can give you. The answer is yes. It's John's vision, and yes, it's all real. But it's giving us a very different perspective. Right? John's vision gives us this perspective of heaven, of the Lamb sitting on a throne, and the 4 elders and all the living creatures gathered around, and everybody who's died in the faith gathered under the altar. Is that real? Yeah. Does that mean everybody's literally under an altar? No, they don't got bodies yet. So it's real, but it's meant to give us a perception of things that... And remember, one of the things we did at Men's Bible Breakfast is we talked about the fact that Revelation was written and sent to the people in Rome. So as a letter of encouragement about how Christ has won the war already. Here's these people going through persecution in Rome. Well, if they're caught with this thing, they're doomed. So John, it's all written in code, right? But Revelation is not meant to scare anybody. It's meant to be a realistic depiction of the victory of Jesus Christ. And in this case, a victory that begins at his birth. But look at, question 4 says, how is this Christmas account also our story? So we've got this woman in here, but then we got this sudden change, right? That in verse 5, she gives birth to a male, one who's to rule the nations, but her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled to the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. There are actually some who have suggested, because we don't hear anything about Mary after Jesus' death and resurrection, that Mary went off into the wilderness, lived for 3+ years, and then was taken to heaven. That's not what this is saying. Right? When was Jesus taken up? Caught up to God and to his throne. His resurrection and ascension. And then the woman goes out into the wilderness, right, for this 1,260 days. This time of this war that now is described from this point on, where because he can't get the child, he goes after the woman. Who's the woman?
The bride of Christ, the church.
The Christian church. Okay? The Christian church. And so, since Satan can't get the child, and the whole plan of salvation is accomplished, right? Now we get this, where is it? Verse 13. And when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the woman was given the 2 wings of the great eagle so that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness to the place where she would be nourished for a time and times and a half a time. The serpent poured constantly after, right? So, but the earth came and blah, 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 right? So I didn't spend a lot of time trying to unpack all the symbolism here, right? But after Jesus completes, and I'll say this part of the plan of salvation, because there is one part of God's plan of salvation that still remains, which is He returns, right? The woman flees to the wilderness, right? And what is our life as the Christian church and as children of God described as in the Bible as we live out our days here on earth? The wilderness. Okay? And who's Satan? Who's the red dragon after now? Us. Right? He couldn't stop Jesus, but what can he do now? He can crush. No, he'll never crush the church. God promises that the gates of hell will never, right, prevail over the church. But he can crush the individual souls of human beings. His only chance now, instead of thwarting the whole plan of salvation, is to take us one by one away from it. Okay? And all of that begins where? Well, it all begins at the manger, right? The time has come where I can't just be messing around with the earth anymore. The time has come. Now, God says, it says in here that, but the woman was given the 2 wings of the great eagle. I don't know what it says in our books here. Okay, so the 2 wings of the great eagle, interestingly enough, this kind of links back, that's what I thought, but I had to check real quick. Kind of links back, right, to Jesus standing in front of the temple in Jerusalem before he is arrested, and he says, "Oh, that I could gather them under my wings," right? That vision of a bird gathering under the wings to protect the young, right? But the woman was given, verse 14, the 2 wings of the great eagle so that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness to the place where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time. So for all time plus. All right? So what is this gathering of the woman? What is this gathering of the church under the wings of God? How is that played out in real life today? Oh, you Lutherans. Huh?
We're the church.
We're the church. So we're the ones being gathered.
That's our job, in my opinion.
This has nothing to do with our job. Sorry, Bart.
Well,
Before we get to that,
but we live in God's grace and we extend His
Thank you.
grace to us. That's our job.
What's the wings that gather the church and protect the church from the dragon? Word and sacrament. The only thing that would have been better is if this eagle had 3 wings, right? Then we could say word and water and bread and wine. But 2 wings works. Word and sacrament. Gathering the church under His wings, feeding the church in the wilderness for all time and all time again, and even a half more time if you're worried about it. Right? So the 1,260 days becomes a time and times and a half a time. Okay? Or in other words, whatever the time is, from the time of Jesus' birth and his, as it says in verse 5, is being caught up to God and to his throne. I didn't check the Greek, but I'm pretty sure that his throne there is not God's throne, but the male child's throne. I'll let Joe go. Sometimes those things are hard because our English has a hard way to put, and I don't know whether the Greek will give us any inklings there. It doesn't matter, because we know Jesus sits at the right hand of the throne of God, the place of all power, of all might, of all authority, right? And the church, the woman is nourished for 1,260 days. This battle is going to go on. Satan, who could not thwart the plan of God, now is out to take people one by one. But the church is gathered under the wings of the eagle and nourished for all time. And we understand God does that through word and sacrament.
So, Pastor,
Yeah.
when it talks of, Satan being the accuser of the brethren,
Yeah.
that's where that fits.
Well, absolutely, yeah. There's other places where Satan is called the accuser, right? Where Satan stands to accuse us before God. Okay? Problem is, when he accuses us before God, what's the answer? It's done. Right? 3 words. It is finished. Or as I reminded, I think I told you last week, the person that I did private confession and absolution to, who was just haunted by their sins, and we got done with the absolution. I said, now I want you to remember, you're the only one that remembers that stuff anymore. God doesn't. It's gone. The only one who's accusing you before God anymore is you. And that's a hard place for us to understand forgiveness, right? Is that God, it's gone. It haunts us, but it's gone. Okay? Good. Questions, comments, thoughts? Yeah.
I think it's really cool to think about, since we already have the biblical account of the birth in the other places, and then to see like the heavenly interpretation. Because whenever I think about Jesus' return in the accounts in Revelation, I always get stuck on how could that possibly happen, or what would that look like. But then when I think, well, it's not going to look like that. It's going to look like what happens on earth. It's going to be that.
Right.
But there's going to be some kind of earthly thing that happens that we can see until we're caught up.
Remember, the Bible is constantly, when it's telling us about Jesus' return, about heavenly things, right? Even this perspective from heaven on the birth of Jesus, it's trying to describe things with human words, because that's what God's given us. But it's trying to describe things with human words that human words can't describe. These are experiences, even John's visions, Jesus' words about his coming again in glory, the angels telling the disciples that he will return as he departed, right? But everybody's going to see him, right? And we're going, yeah, but when he returns, it's going to be day here and night in China, and I don't know how can everybody? Let's just right? The hows, we have all these hows limited by math and physics and biology and things that we think we understand perfectly, but we don't, okay? We've got all these limitations, even as Revelation recounts the recreation of Eden when Jesus returns. And we're trying to figure out, but how is all the people who ever believe in Jesus going to live in the Garden of Eden? And we're going, we're so limited, but we also have to remember that it'll all make sense when it happens, right? And however it happens, I can guarantee it's going to be different than anything our minds can possibly imagine, right? Thank you. Yeah. It's got to be better, right? Isaiah talks about, fine wine and aged meat. And I just want pizza and beer. So, somehow, right, heaven's going to be, and this whole thing's going to work out, and we're going to have a place where our feet are touching something because we're going to be human still again. And when Adam and Eve were human and perfect without sin, they had their feet on the ground and they had work to do. But it was all perfect, right? Is it going to be like that again? Or, I don't know. I guess we'll find out when we get there. And oh, by the way, nobody else knows yet either. Right? I mean, the folks who have gone before us aren't there yet. Their bodies are still in the ground or wherever, right? I got questions the other day again about the folks that were in the plane on 9/11. Where are they? I'm not worried about it. God can make us out of nothing to start with. He can certainly gather our molecules together from wherever they are on the earth. I know from a physics standpoint, their molecules are somewhere. Right? But good. Thoughts? Questions? Okay, one more. I don't remember what I wrote. Oh, there's more going on than Silent Night, Holy Night. I'm imagining my brain at the 9 o'clock service on Christmas Eve when we're having this nice, quiet, dark, bright, candlelit service, and I'm going to have visions of Revelation 12 going through my brain, and I'm going to be waiting for the tanks to arrive, and things start blowing up, right? And where a dragon comes swooping through. How does this account of Jesus' birth bring to life the real meaning of Christmas?
It's a little sobering.
It's a little sobering. Okay, tell me more.
Well, we're also jolly around the season, and there's so many things distracting us from what we're really celebrating, that this really brings it home to what it really
is. Yeah.
God loved us that much that he was willing to go through all of this, and drag us the whole bit, to save us, and to set that little one.
I mean, Jesus did not come to earth ignorant of what was about to happen. Otherwise, he wouldn't have perspired blood in the Garden of Gethsemane in agony over what was about to happen. He understood completely. Good. Joanna, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, and just kind of building on what was said earlier, it brings new depth to the idea that Jesus is the reason for the season. It's not just that, it's salvation. And salvation could not have been achieved without this incarnation of God into man.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, I think, Teresa.
I was going to say, in reference to your question, there was really nothing silent about the night of God.
There's nothing silent, not from this perspective, right? Like I said, this is kind of the storming of the beach kind of picture, right? I hadn't thought about doing this. I didn't think about this until early this week. But when I remembered that this account exists, it kind of struck me. I hadn't read it in a while, and I read it again, and I said, I think one of the things that challenges us at Christmas is, even as the rest of the world kind of gives us the fact that they're going to allow us to celebrate Jesus' birth, right? It becomes kind of this, it's a great celebration, Christmas is wonderful. And I remember how somebody said it, I guess Barb, when I said it wasn't about what we know, but somebody else said something about the cross. I think too often we disconnect Christmas from Good Friday and Easter, right? And so we say, well, salvation's all about Easter, Good Friday and Easter. And it is. If Good Friday and Easter don't happen, Christmas is worthless. But I think we disconnect the two too much. And this reconnects them completely. right? And not only reconnects those two things, but then connects everything that's happening afterwards until Jesus returns as all part of this, not only part of God's plan, but all part of this great, if you will, cosmic war that's going on. The end is absolutely certain. The end happened on the cross and with the empty tomb, but the battles are still raging on, right? And right, we read this and we go, oh my goodness, right? If this was sent to the Romans to make them feel better, Matthew's account of Christmas is a whole lot better. But what is there in here that the Christians in Rome would have read, and we talked about it, would have read and said, see, we're going to be okay. I mean, does anybody have to tell them when they're under persecution that Satan's out to get them? Absolutely not, right? But what is John's vision? What does God through John's vision remind them? One, the one who was born was caught up to God and is sitting on his throne. And two, is gathering his church under his wings in word and sacrament to nourish them until the end. So this story is not meant to bring some kind of scary vision of Christmas. There's a new Christmas movie out with a Santa that goes around blowing people up and stuff.
Christmas sleigh or something.
Violent Night. Yeah. Okay. It's not meant to bring this weird story in to make Christmas suddenly scary. It's meant to do the opposite. To bring the reality of Christmas into focus so that we can understand how God, starting that day in this great war over our souls, is the one who is victorious and is the one who is caring for us till the end.
It struck me this year, after many years, that Advent isn't the end of the year, but the beginning.
Yeah, it's the beginning of the year, not the end. Yeah. Good. Anything else? Yes, sir.
A few comments earlier when you were kind of breaking down the timeline of all the chances Satan had to derail the plan. And I thought of, Matthew or whatever, where Peter's kind of telling Jesus, you don't really have to do this. And he's like, get behind me, Satan.
Yep.
And it's so shocking.
Yep, that's another one.
But from this perspective, it totally makes sense as another time when Peter, not even knowingly, became a mouthpiece for Satan, and Jesus immediately was like, I see what's happening here, stop it.
Yeah. Or John's disciples, are you the one, or are we supposed to wait for another? Right? There's constantly, we see these seeds of doubt and even these confessions of anti-faith, or whatever you want to call it, right? Not that Peter was outside the faith at that moment, but a complete misunderstanding, right? Get behind me. I mean, even to the point of Jesus is risen from the dead. They're standing on the mountaintop before his ascension, and the disciples ask, are you now going to do your thing? Right? Satan already knows he can't get Jesus, but who's he working on still at that moment? Is the disciples who aren't really going to understand this till Pentecost, and then the whole of the history of the New Testament church opens up in front of us. And if we think that the history of the New Testament church is different than the history of the Old Testament church, it really isn't. The whole history of the Old Testament church is God accomplishing his promises in spite of the people. And the New Testament church is no different. We'd like to think we are, but we're not. Okay? Pretty cool, huh? Hope I didn't ruin anybody's Christmas. Hope nobody, but if you want to add a red dragon to your nativity scene, go for it. Okay? I'm sure you can find a red Tyrannosaurus Rex or something that you can, stick in amongst the sheep and the goats. If you're going to add the kings to your nativity set, you might as well add the red dragon, right? At least the red dragon belongs there. The kings don't. Or, you can have peacocks in there too.
In our museums.
Yes, because there were a lot of peacocks around Israel. Well, you know, somebody was asking Pastor Berlinski the other day because one of the chrismons on the tree is a pelican. And they were wondering why a pelican, because they wanted to hide it around the back because they thought it didn't exist. And so Pastor Berlinski was describing to them why the pelican became became a symbol for the church. And it actually has to do with fishermen, and fishermen saw pelicans picking at their bodies before they fed their children. And what they reasoned is the pelicans were causing a wound and feeding the children their blood, which is what Jesus does, feeds his children blood from his wounds. And so the pelican became this great symbol for the church, completely out of a misunderstanding of what the pelicans were doing, because they weren't picking themselves to cause blood and feeding. Yeah. I'm sure there's a more...
The internet.
Okay. Yeah, the internet.
The peacock can be found.
Oh, peacock.
The majority of Renaissance nativity scenes is a reminder of the resurrection of Christ and therefore eternal life.
Yeah. Peacock. I thought you were going to give me another explanation for the pelican, which I'm sure there's other explanations for the pelican that are less gory. But all right, let's close with the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. We do have to take everything down. And before you leave, I have a test for you. What time is church next Sunday?